Tim, would you extend that to helping young Christians who are being inconsistent? In other words, how does the gospel then work out in people's lives once they have become Christians? Or if you start seeing a church that apparently is genuinely made up of believers, however immature, but they're drifting off in one fashion or another, do you preach more law? Is this Calvin's third use of the law? Or do you give more gospel? How do you handle all that now? But how does the gospel still transform?
You're asking a Presbyterian.
Absolutely.
Yeah, on the law. I'd rather actually do a little bit of an end run around that issue about the use of the law. I actually hinted at this before. I think the opposite of moralism is cheap grace. I really appreciated reading Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship in the earliest days of my Christian life. Especially when you realize he was writing it in the context of a German church that had capitulated to Hitler, and it essentially had kind of turned to Luther's justification by grace as a way of saying, basically avoiding the importance of prophetic moral seriousness. So what Bonhoeffer had to say is that this grace of God is free to you but costly to God, and the law is so important, or the will of God is so important, the moral absolutes of God are so important, that God couldn't just forgive us. Jesus had to die, turn away his wrath against our sin, pay the penalty. If you see that, then I consider this a paradox. On the one hand, I say the law of God is so serious that it cost Jesus his life, and when I see the Bible saying, thou shalt not commit adultery, sex is for just inside marriage, I have to take that seriously. It cost Jesus his life that human beings were violating that. You can never look at that without fear and trembling. But at the same time, I'm told, in spite of my imperfections, that there's no condemnation for me ever again, even if I screw up in the future. That's the paradox. Because when you say it's costly grace, you can't be morally lax, and at the same time, you can't always be beating yourself up about your failures. And it is tough, I think, for a pastor, a preacher, to have both those shoes drop.
So you must then think, I'm pushing the question now, gospel-centered, and what this group stands for. That must be close to why this is important.
And the word centered gets across this idea of cheap grace, moralism, gospel, or relativism, legalism, gospel. There's something balanced, and yet at the same time not a compromise about the gospel that really sets us apart, even, I would have to say, from fundamentalism and liberalism. If you define fundamentalism in the more negative sense of separatist, legalistic, liberalism, if you define the more the more negative sense of relativistic and latitudinarian and so forth, then we are gospel-centered.
Yeah. So God, when we define this coalition as gospel-centered, that's a code word for advancing gospel-centered life? That
belief, living,
everything,
everything,
parenting,
thinking out of
deciding which movies to go to.
That's right, everything. Without legalism, but never. See, even after a person becomes a Christian, the law does not have the power to sanctify. It's still the gospel that sanctifies. So there is a third use of the law, but it's only by virtue of driving us to Christ again and again and again.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree that you're saved by going back to your justification. Yeah. You're sanctified by going back to your justification and applying it and thinking it out. So there's a nice unification there. You're not moving away from justification into sanctification.
I like the way, actually, you keep talking about it as paradox. I think that's really
okay. Let me put either of you on the spot here. Pornography, lust. Here's a guy basically clicking in every day. How does justification, gospel, cross, sanctification help him conquer whatever measure of conquering he may attain? So not just Jesus said, gouge out your eye or you're going to hell. That's one kind of motivation, and not a bad one. It raises the moral stakes to eternity. But we're saying success in that part of life better be fought significantly with a centering on your being justified or the gospel.
Yeah, I'd say the costly grace gives you both things that you need. You actually do need to loathe the violation of the sanctity of sexuality. You have to see that's the costly side. Jesus died because we violate God's will in this area. And so there has to be, you might say, a negative. There has to be some times in which I don't do pornography just because I know this is repugnant to God. But on the other hand, a lot of people go to the false intimacy of pornography because inside they hate themselves. They really don't understand God's love. It hasn't really broken through. And so they're just, they're consoling themselves because they're empty. So there needs to be this balance of, on the one hand, tremendous affirmation, God's love, no matter what. And yet at the same time, there's got to be a repugnance. Now, how do you get that? I'd say legalism gives you the repugnance and not the affirmation that you need on the inside. And cheap grace might say God loves you, though frankly I don't think it's all that affirming to say God just loves everybody. But cheap grace at least tries to affirm without the repugnance. But this idea of costly grace, the paradox of Jesus dying because of my sin, and at the same time, now that Jesus has died, my sins can't condemn me, gives you both the negative and the positive you need to overcome pornography.
I think, I agree with that, but I think that there are some other things that can be said that belong to the communitarian nature of the church,
Yes.
the family,
I was
and so
just
on.
going to get there, and I'm so
Oh,
glad
sorry.
you're doing that.
Oh,
Go
in which
ahead.
case you go right ahead.
No,
Forgive
no,
me for cutting you
no.
off.
After you.
Some kind of accountability on the pornography thing can be very, very useful.
Totally.
And this as an act of love from brother to brother. We put some guys on our church on covenant eyes. You know, that they just have no access to computers except those that have covenant eye stipulations showing all their websites to 2 or 3 faithful brothers, and they pray together. You know, and sometimes when the addiction to this sin has been so deep, we take away the computer. You know, apart from when you're doing your financial stuff, then you do it on an open computer with your spouse nearby, but at the same time you're building up the glories of Christ, the wonders of the cross, the shame of sin, so that eventually the whole thing becomes more and more and more repugnant. Now, because we're still fallen and we're going to be fallen till the end of the age, there might be some people who best receive the love of Christ in their lives in part by brothers in the congregation who are also holding them accountable in a variety of ways. But on the other hand, on the long haul, it's not going to be just cold turkey and saying no, and this is disgusting. They've got to see how ugly it is for themselves in the light of the blood of Christ on the cross pouring from his veins so that they might be reconciled to God. And eventually, I mean, I've seen some of these guys eventually begin to say things like, I'm just so ashamed. I don't know how come I didn't see how dirty it was. I mean, it's just awful. And they're beginning to see the glory of the love of their own marriage and the importance of understanding the spouse in image of God terms and in loving her as Christ loved the church and all kinds of other relational matters that are also part of the building up and the outworking of grace in the life. That too is gospel centered in that the gospel then transforms our relationships and our marriages. And
Footnote: the accountability partners have to have gospel character.
Okay, exactly.
Because
Otherwise it's more
otherwise they'll be
legalism.
too
Yeah.
easy or too hard.
Yeah.
Actually, they won't show that they see a relapse as a serious thing, or they'll be very condemning. So unless the gospel's in them, their accountability won't be all that effective.
Let me build a bridge between the catchword gospel-centered that we're working on right now and another one, namely God-centered or Christ-centered or Christ-exalting. Because one of the things that the gospel-centered accountability partner will do, and a pastor will continually do, is so magnify the beauty of Christ, the glory of Christ, the wonders of Christ, that the heart, the hungry heart of the porn-prone person is gradually satisfied by something far superior, so that he is, in a positive way, weaned off of this. So my point there is 2 Corinthians 4:4.
Right.
The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. Now, I hope that one of the effects of the Gospel Coalition is to cultivate an army of pastors who succeed, or at least work very hard, at making the glory of Christ in the gospel so beautiful it has a weaning effect off of sin. on people. So to me, these two things, gospel-centered and Christ-centered or God-centered or glory-exalting,
or whatever. Yes.
will be effective
Yeah.
in the purifying of the church in a positive way rather than the
Right.
only negative, duty-driven way of leave that alone, it's wrong. So,
Right.
but that calls for a certain kind of word ministry that gets back to your priestly thing, I think.
Yes, I was just going to say that.
You're-
Because the gospel-centered thing has a little bit more to do with the prophetic. It's getting our balances right. The God-centered, Christ-exalting is talking much more about the priestly existential aspect that's got to be there.
And if it seems to me that in our Reformed orientation, there are a lot of guys very enamored by a theology that's beautifully coherent, and their heart does not seem to be authentically thrilled with the God of that gospel. They haven't broken through the structures to the person in a way that seems to have an echo right here, so that when they preach, they're not just setting people's minds right about the 5 points or whatever, but that they're setting people's hearts miraculously awakened and right and thrilled, so that when they go home and they're standing there in front of their computer with ready to click, something new, some new affection is controlling, not just a new idea
And then-
warning.
Right.